That evening is still carved into my memory like a bruise that never fully fades. I can still see the glow of the restaurant lights on the red brick walls, still hear the hum of conversations from nearby tables, still feel the uneasy knot in my stomach as I walked in behind my son. Connor held the door for me out of habit, not affection, his eyes already drifting toward the private dining room where his wife waited. I should have noticed the tension in his shoulders. I should have trusted my instinct. But a mother always hopes her fears are wrong. Sienna had chosen the place herself, a high-end spot in downtown San Marcos called Ember and Oak, all dark wood and Edison bulbs and plates that looked too pretty to eat from. She loved places like that. She loved anything that made her feel like she had climbed a rung higher than everyone else. When she spotted me entering, her smile tightened before she stood to greet us. She moved close enough to kiss my cheek, but pulled back just before touching me, like I was something that might ruin her makeup. "So glad you made it, Maggie." Her voice was sweet on the surface, but the tone underneath was ice. I took my seat across from her. Connor sat beside her, not beside me. Even that small detail stung more than I expected. I had chosen a simple blouse and slacks for the evening. Nothing fancy. Nothing that could possibly be taken the wrong way. Still, I could feel Sienna's eyes scanning me head to toe as if searching for something to criticize. She lifted her glass of wine, took a slow sip, and tapped the rim with her fingernail. "You look comfortable tonight." It was a compliment, shaped like an insult, and she knew it. The server came to take our orders, and I kept my hands folded in my lap to steady myself. I told myself this dinner was a chance to mend fences. That is what I had hoped when Connor called me that morning and said Sienna wanted to make things right. Even then, I had felt a pinch of doubt, but I pushed it aside. A mother wants her child to be happy more than she wants to be right. The appetizers arrived, some sort of charred artichokes with lemon aioli. I tried to eat slowly, to ease into conversation. But every time I spoke, Sienna cut in with a louder story of her own or nudged Connor as if to remind him to laugh at something she said. It was small things at first. A smirk at my old-fashioned phone. A little laugh when I asked what a certain dish was. Nothing overt, nothing I could point to, but each one piled onto the next, until I felt myself shrinking inside my chair. I cleared my throat, hoping to guide the conversation somewhere neutral. I mentioned the repairs Connor had been helping with at the ranch. Before I finished my sentence, Sienna made a soft groan and rolled her eyes in a way she did not bother to hide. "Oh, please. Maggie, let him breathe. The ranch is exhausting enough without you finding extra chores." She laughed lightly and touched Connor's arm. He looked down at his plate instead of meeting my eyes. I felt the floor shift under me. I had not asked him for anything he had not offered. He came out on weekends because he said he missed home. But Sienna was performing for the room, for her own sense of power, and she knew Connor would not contradict her in front of me. The main dishes arrived. Sienna barely touched hers. She pushed the plate away and sighed dramatically. "I swear the seasoning here is unbearable. Some people just have no palate." Her eyes flicked to me, just long enough for me to understand she meant exactly what she wanted me to hear. My cheeks warmed. I focused on cutting my chicken even though my hands felt clumsy. I had endured rude people in my life, but something about being belittled in front of my son on a night meant for reconciliation sliced deeper than I expected. Connor finally spoke. "Maybe we should just stick to wine. You know how my mom and spice never mix." He said it in a joking tone, but it was still another little betrayal, another small wound. He used to brag about my cooking, used to ask for my pot roast every birthday. He knew exactly what his words meant. I felt a quiet desperation rise in me. I needed air. I excused myself to the restroom and steadied myself against the counter once inside. The mirror showed a woman trying too hard to stay composed, a woman who had given her life to her son only to find herself an inconvenience in the presence of his wife. When I returned to the table, the mood had shifted even colder. Sienna leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine with a slow, deliberate motion. She waited until I sat down before she began her final blow. "You know, Maggie, you should be grateful we even invited you tonight. We all know how intense you can get with family matters." She laughed softly. "I mean, you do tend to take over everything." My breath caught. The room tightened. The clink of silverware from other tables felt distant. Connor looked away again and said nothing. That silence, his silence, cut deeper than her words. I swallowed every emotion rising in my throat. All the years I had carried him. All the nights I stayed up worrying when he was sick or grieving or lost. All of it seemed to collapse into a single quiet moment across that polished wooden table. I placed my napkin carefully beside my plate. I stood. I did not trust myself to speak because I knew whatever came out might shatter more than I could repair. I turned toward the exit, each step measured, each breath tight in my chest. I did not look back. No one tried to stop me. No one called my name. The cool night air struck my face when I stepped outside. I walked to my truck feeling each heartbeat like a dull thud of disappointment. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment before turning the key. The road back to the ranch was dark and familiar, a ribbon of asphalt surrounded by quiet fields. The ranch lights glowed faintly in the distance, waiting like an old friend who had never asked anything of me except care and memory. Inside the house, the stillness felt heavier than usual. I hung my keys on the hook and sat at the kitchen table where I had shared years of meals with my late husband and my son. The silence reminded me of the distance between who Connor used to be and who he had allowed himself to become. I made a cup of chamomile tea, hoping it would steady my hands. As the steam rose, I replayed the dinner again and again. Each insult, each dismissal, each moment my son chose silence over standing up for me. I tried to understand how we had arrived here, how love could twist into something that left a mother abandoned in plain sight. I stayed at that table long after the tea had gone cold. The moon drifted across the window, and the shadows in the room stretched and softened. The ranch was quiet around me, too quiet. It had been the one place where I always felt safe. Tonight, even this house felt heavier, as if it knew something was coming. I finally stood and turned off the kitchen light. On my way down the hall, I heard my phone buzz from the counter. I glanced at the screen and saw Sienna's name glowing in the dark. A single missed call, then another, then a text. "We need to talk. It is urgent. Call me back now." I stared at the messages, my heartbeat quickening. Something was wrong, something she feared, and somehow I knew it had to do with whatever she thought she had hidden from me. I did not call her back. I simply stood in the quiet hallway of my home, holding the phone, sensing that the balance of everything between us was about to shift. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, holding the phone, watching her name fade from the screen as the notifications disappeared. The house was quiet, but my thoughts were loud and sharp. I set the phone down, turned away from it, and walked to the living room, trying to steady the churn in my chest. Whatever she wanted could wait until morning. I told myself that. But sleep never came. I lay awake listening to the distant hum of the wind pushing across the fields. Around 4, I finally drifted off. But the rest did nothing to settle my nerves. When the sun came up, I moved through the kitchen on autopilot. I started the coffee pot, fed the old border collie out back, opened the blinds. The morning light spread over the ranch like it always did, but even the familiar gold of the Texas sunrise could not quiet the uneasy feeling sitting in my stomach. I checked my phone again. 3 missed calls from Sienna, 2 messages. The last one, sent just after midnight, said she needed my help. The words did not match the woman who had taunted me across a dinner table only hours before. Something had cracked in her confidence, something unexpected. Just after 7, Connor called. I felt my breath hitch as I answered. He sounded tired, as if he had been awake the whole night too. He asked if everything was all right between me and Sienna. He said she came home upset and would not tell him why. I almost told him what happened at the restaurant, how she humiliated me in front of strangers and used his silence as a weapon. But he was my son. His voice carried a raw edge I did not recognize, and I could not bring myself to push more weight onto him. I simply said I left because I was not feeling great. He seemed relieved to hear anything that resembled neutrality. Before hanging up, he gently asked if I could talk to her later. I said I would think about it. I spent the next hour walking the perimeter of the property with my coffee. The ranch had a way of speaking in its own rhythm. The trees along the fence line shifted softly. The cattle in the far pasture moved in slow, calm circles. The gravel under my boots crunched in a steady pattern. It helped ground me, helped keep my mind from spiraling into the worst possibilities. Still, every time the phone buzzed in my pocket, I jumped. The 3rd time I finally checked. It was neither Connor nor Sienna. It was Sheriff Ramirez. He rarely called this early unless there was something urgent. He asked if he could stop by for a few minutes. His tone was direct but careful. I agreed. And 20 minutes later, his truck pulled into the driveway. I met him on the porch. He climbed the steps and settled into the chair across from mine, resting his hat on his knee. He had known my late husband well and had always treated me with the steady respect of an old friend. He asked if anything unusual had happened recently. I hesitated before answering. "Sheriff," I said, "I cannot tell if you mean something criminal or something personal." He gave a faint nod and said he had received an anonymous call last night. A woman from the staff at Ember and Oak claimed she witnessed a heated moment between me and my daughter-in-law. She said the tone Sienna used toward me raised concern for elder mistreatment. The sheriff made clear he was not making accusations, but by law, he had to check in whenever someone flagged a possible issue. I felt heat rise in my chest. I told him I had not been harmed and that nothing illegal happened, but I also could not pretend the evening had been normal. He studied my face for a moment, as if to judge whether I was telling the full truth. He asked questions about my relationship with Connor and Sienna, whether I had ever felt pressured to give up control of the ranch or my finances. The questions cut deeper than he likely intended, because there had been glimmers of those pressures long before last night. I admitted as much, but assured him no one had taken anything from me. He asked one final question. Did I feel safe? I said yes. He did not fully believe me, but he respected my answer and let it be. Before he left, he mentioned something that froze me in place. He said Sienna had been involved in a complaint at her workplace several months ago. There had been concerns about missing funds, nothing proven, nothing filed formally, but whispers that she had been part of a bookkeeping irregularity that was quickly swept under the rug by the restaurant owner. He said he thought I should know, given the tension he sensed between us. After he drove off, I stood on the porch, gripping the wooden railing until my hands ached. Pieces that had never made sense before began to shift inside my mind. I remembered the designer bag she carried on a salary that should not support it, the sudden weekend trips to Austin, The subtle comments about money, about investments, about how the ranch could be worth so much more if used differently. My pulse hammered beneath my ribs. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of another vehicle turning up the long drive. Connor stepped out of his truck before it fully stopped. And when he walked toward me, I saw the weight in his eyes. He asked if we could talk inside. I led him to the kitchen. He sat at the table where I had spent half the night awake. He rubbed his temples and finally said he needed to know the truth about what happened last night. He said Sienna insisted I had overreacted and stormed out without reason. He said she cried for an hour and accused him of forcing her into a dinner she never wanted. I listened silently because he needed to get the words out. After he finished, I told him what truly happened, not with anger, but with the clarity that comes when you have been pushed too far. I described the mocking tone, the belittling comments, the moment she told me I should be grateful they had invited me. His face shifted as he listened. First disbelief, then confusion, then something sharper, something like shame. He said that did not sound like the version she told him. I told him that was between them, but that I would not sit through another evening of being treated that way. He asked if I had said anything to provoke her. The question stung, but I understood it came from a place of fear, not accusation. I told him no. I had gone there hoping to mend our family, not break it further. We fell silent. The kitchen felt smaller, the air heavier. Finally he stood, pacing once before stopping near the window. He said Sienna left the house early that morning, acting nervous and guarded. She had taken her laptop and a folder of documents and told him not to ask questions. He said she seemed frightened, not angry. That detail sat in my mind like a seed. I told him she had tried to call me several times last night. He looked startled. He asked what she wanted. I said I did not know because I had not called back. His shoulders tensed. He asked to see the messages. I handed him the phone. He read every word slowly, his jaw tightening. He finally said he needed to find her. He needed to know why she would reach out to me after humiliating me in public. He left quickly, nearly tripping over the front steps as he hurried to his truck. When the sound of his engine faded, the house returned to its uneasy quiet. I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair where he had been sitting. The morning light slanted through the window, catching particles of dust that drifted lazily in the air. Something was shifting around me, something I could not yet see clearly. The ranch had felt like a refuge for so long, but now it felt like the calm before a storm that had already begun to form beyond the horizon. I stayed in the kitchen a long time after Connor left, listening to the quiet tick of the old wall clock and the faint rustle of branches tapping against the siding outside. The morning calm used to comfort me. Today it felt thin, like a veil hiding something I did not yet understand. I tried to distract myself by wiping down the counters and straightening the mail stack, but every task felt shallow compared to the steady churn of worry moving inside me. Around noon, I finally stepped out onto the porch. The air had warmed, carrying the scent of cedar from the grove near the old barn. I walked down toward the pasture fence, hoping the rhythm of the ranch might help settle me. The cattle moved lazily under the sun. The familiar landscape usually soothed me, but my mind kept circling back to Sienna and the strange urgency in her messages. I wondered if she had meant to reach out before things spiraled. I wondered if I should have called her back. The questions followed me like shadows. By early afternoon, I had managed to convince myself I needed to check on the storage shed behind the barn. It was an excuse, really, a place to put my hands on something solid. Daniel had kept so many of his tools there, and sometimes I walked through just to feel close to him. I unlocked the shed and stepped inside. The familiar smell of old cedar and motor oil drifted through the warm air. Dust floated in the sunlight that cut through the gaps in the boards. I ran my fingers along the workbench where Daniel once fixed everything from tractor parts to picture frames. I lifted the lid of an old wooden chest where we stored documents years ago. Most of it was harmless paperwork, nothing important. But as I sifted through it, a thin envelope slipped from between two binders. My breath caught as I picked it up. I recognized Daniel's handwriting. It was not the original letter he left before he died. That one was locked in the safe inside the house. This was something different, smaller, addressed to me but never opened. I stared at it for several seconds before sliding it into my pocket. I did not want to read it standing in the dust and heat. My heart beat faster as I closed the chest and stepped back outside. I took only a few steps toward the house when I heard an engine in the distance. A small car approached the ranch road at a hurried pace. I narrowed my eyes, waiting for the vehicle to come into view. When it finally pulled up near the barn, I saw a young woman step out. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. I recognized her from the restaurant. She had been one of the servers that evening. She lifted a hand in greeting, her expression uneasy. I walked toward her slowly. She introduced herself as Emily. She said she did not want to intrude, but needed to talk to me. Her voice trembled slightly as she explained that she had worked with Sienna long before last night. She looked around nervously before continuing. She said the restaurant staff had always been cautious around Sienna because she had a history of bending rules and keeping secrets. Then she lowered her voice and told me that Sienna had been involved in the financial discrepancies the sheriff mentioned. According to Emily, money had gone missing from the restaurant accounts, and Sienna had been the last one to handle certain transactions. The owner covered it up to avoid scandal, but the staff knew something was wrong. I listened quietly, though my pulse raced. Emily said she came because she felt bad about what happened at dinner. She said she saw how Sienna spoke to me and could not shake the feeling that I deserved to know the truth. Before leaving, she handed me a flash drive. She said it contained copies of documents and a short video that might explain why Sienna had been acting so erratic. I thanked her, and she gave me a sympathetic nod before getting into her car and driving off. I stood alone in the yard with the flash drive in my hand. The weight of it felt heavier than something so small should feel. I walked back toward the house slowly. My thoughts churned. Why would Sienna reach out to me in a panic unless something had gone terribly wrong? Did she think I possessed information she feared? Or did she believe I was the only person who might still shield Connor and protect something she had done? Inside the house, the air felt cooler. I sat at my desk and turned on the computer. My hands hesitated above the keyboard as I plugged in the flash drive. A folder opened automatically. Inside were scanned receipts, account summaries, and what appeared to be an internal email thread from the restaurant owner to his accountant. The tone was clear. They had discovered irregular transfers tied to Sienna's login credentials and were preparing to terminate her quietly if she did not return the missing funds. The email dated back 3 months. She had never mentioned any of it to Connor. I scrolled further until I saw a video file. I clicked on it. The grainy clip showed part of the restaurant office. In the frame, I saw Sienna sitting at the desk, flipping through bank statements. Her face looked tense. She glanced up at the camera, unaware she was being recorded, and whispered something I could not fully make out. But it sounded like she needed to fix things before someone found out. The video ended abruptly. My throat tightened as the pieces slowly came together. I leaned back in the chair, feeling a wave of exhaustion and clarity wash over me. Whatever had happened at dinner, whatever humiliation she had thrown at me, had been fueled by fear, not fear of me, but fear of exposure. She had been unraveling, and I had become the easiest target. But the part I could not shake was why she reached out afterward, why she called me in desperation rather than her husband. I opened Daniel's envelope next, his familiar handwriting spread across the page in soft lines. He wrote that if I ever found myself in a situation where someone was pressuring me about the ranch or about money, I should trust my instincts. He reminded me that people often reveal their true intentions through small moments, small missteps. He wrote that he believed I would always know the difference between someone who loved our family and someone who loved what we had. Reading his words brought a sting to my eyes. I closed the letter gently and placed it back into its envelope. My heart felt heavier but clearer. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood near the window overlooking the long driveway. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. The ranch had weathered storms, droughts, and the slow passing of time. It would weather this too. I remained there for several minutes before I noticed a familiar truck turning onto the property. Connor. He pulled up quickly and got out, his face carrying the strain of someone trying to hold too many things at once. He walked toward the porch with long, urgent strides. I stepped outside to meet him, the screen door creaking behind me. He said he had not been able to reach Sienna. Her phone was off, no messages delivered, no signs of where she had gone. He looked shaken in a way I had not seen since he was a boy grieving his father. He asked if she had contacted me again. I shook my head. He asked if I knew anything. He did not. I hesitated, unsure how much to tell him and how quickly. I suggested we sit down inside, that I needed to show him something, but that he had to stay calm. He nodded, though his breath had grown short and his hands trembled slightly at his sides. As we walked back toward the house, I sensed the shift in the air again, as if the path ahead was narrowing and the choices we made next would decide everything that came after. Connor followed me into the house with a stiffness in his steps, as if he were bracing himself for something he could not yet name. I walked ahead of him toward the small office off the hallway, the room where Daniel kept his records and where I stored everything too important to leave lying around. The air in the room felt cooler than the rest of the house, shaded by the old oak outside the window. I motioned for Connor to sit, but he stayed standing, arms folded tight across his chest. I told him I needed him to stay open-minded. He nodded, but his jaw tightened. I reached for the flash drive, still plugged into the computer, and opened the folder. I clicked through the documents slowly, letting him read the headers before explaining anything in detail. As he scanned the screen, his brows pulled together. His voice sounded strained when he finally spoke. "Where did you get this?" I told him about Emily visiting the ranch and that she had worked with Sienna for nearly 2 years. I repeated her words as carefully as I could, choosing them one at a time so they would not fall on him like blows. He took a step back and ran a hand through his hair. He kept saying that it did not make sense, that Sienna would have told him if she was in trouble, that he would have helped her. He looked at the video clip twice, leaning close to the monitor as if hoping it would reveal something more generous than what it showed. When he straightened up, his face had gone pale. He asked if I believed Sienna stole the funds. I answered truthfully. I did not know all the details, but I believed she had been hiding something for a long time. He swallowed hard, staring down at the floor, trying to arrange his thoughts. I told him there was more. I took out the envelope with Daniel's handwriting and unfolded the letter. I did not hand it to him. I read aloud the parts that spoke of trusting my instincts, the parts where Daniel warned that people sometimes enter our lives for the wrong reasons. Connor listened with a pained expression, as if each word tugged at memories he had tried to bury. When I finished reading, neither of us spoke for a long moment. He finally sat down, his elbows resting heavily on his knees. He asked what I thought Sienna was afraid of. I said I could not answer that for her, but whatever she feared seemed tied to money, secrecy, and perhaps the possibility of being exposed. His breathing grew uneven. He looked like a man piecing together a puzzle he did not want to complete. The quiet of the house broke suddenly when Connor's phone began to ring. He glanced at the screen, then looked up at me with wide eyes. It was Lily, the owner of Ember and Oak. He answered quickly. I could hear her faint voice through the receiver, fast and urgent. He kept asking her to slow down. Then he stood abruptly. She told him Sienna came to the restaurant early that morning, before staff arrived, and asked to see the office. The owner arrived shortly after and walked in on Sienna going through old files. When confronted, she panicked and left in such a hurry she nearly hit a delivery truck backing into the alley. Lily said she looked scared, not angry. Connor lowered the phone and leaned against the desk. He whispered that he did not understand how everything had spiraled so quickly. I placed a hand on his arm and told him fear makes people do reckless things, especially when they think the walls are closing in. He asked if I thought Sienna might come here again. I told him I did not know. The uncertainty hung between us. He said he needed to find her before things got worse. He grabbed his keys. I followed him to the porch. The wind had picked up and dust swirled in thin lines across the driveway. Before he climbed into his truck, he paused and looked back at me. His eyes were full of conflict, fear, and something like guilt. He said he was sorry for how he acted at the dinner, for not standing up for me. I told him we could talk about that later. Right now, he needed to keep a clear head and stay safe. I watched him drive away, the engine fading into the open distance. As the silence returned, I felt the weight of the day deepen. I stepped back into the house, locking the door behind me, not out of fear, but out of instinct. I walked through each room, checking the windows, feeling the strange awareness that something was shifting inside the story of our family, something I could not slow or soften. When I reached the living room, I sat down, hands clasped, and tried to settle the tremor inside my chest. Barely 10 minutes passed before I heard another car approach. I stood quickly and peered through the side window. I recognized the sedan. It belonged to Mr. Miller. He climbed out with a leather briefcase in hand and walked toward the porch with a gravity that made my breath tighten. I opened the door before he reached the steps. He greeted me gently and asked if he could come in. I led him to the dining room. He sat across from me, set the briefcase on the table, and folded his hands. He said he wanted to update me on something that had come to his attention. His tone was measured in that way lawyers use when preparing you for something heavy. He said someone had contacted his office asking questions about the ranch title and about whether I had full decision-making authority. He traced his finger along the briefcase as he spoke. He said the person did not identify themselves directly, but the questions suggested they knew about the property clause Daniel had left. Questions like whether I could be removed from managing the estate if declared mentally compromised, or if I could be pressured into signing a transfer of authority. My chest tightened. I asked if he knew who it was. He shook his head but said he suspected it was connected to Sienna. My pulse quickened. I asked if such a thing was possible. Could someone really try to challenge my competence without grounds? He said it would not be easy, but he had seen cases brought forward with less reason. He encouraged me to keep all documents secure and to consider seeing my doctor for a cognitive assessment, just to have a record on file should anyone attempt to challenge my rights. The words felt unreal, but also painfully plausible. I nodded slowly. The air in the room felt thinner. He placed a reassuring hand on the table and reminded me that Daniel had written his will with these possibilities in mind, that he trusted my judgment more than anything. Those words steadied me more than I expected. Before he left, he asked one final question. He asked if I had noticed any unusual behavior from Sienna in the past week. I let out a soft breath and said unusual was becoming an understatement. After he drove off, I sat for a long while in the quiet dining room, gripping the edge of the table, outside. Clouds had begun to gather in slow gray layers. The wind rattled the windows lightly. I felt the growing sense that everything was building towards something inevitable. I stood and moved through the house, turning on a few lights despite the hour. The soft glow made the rooms feel less hollow. I had just returned to the living room when the sound of footsteps approached the porch. They were quick and uneven, as if the person was in a rush or running from something. I froze, listening. Then a sharp knock hit the door, followed by another. The air around me went still. I stepped toward the entryway and placed my hand on the knob, waiting to hear the voice on the other side. I waited, holding my breath, until a familiar voice broke through the door in a strained whisper, calling my name with a desperation I had never heard from her before. I opened the door slowly and found Sienna standing there. Her face was flushed. Her hair clung to her cheeks as if she had been crying or running, and her hand shook as she clutched her handbag against her chest. She pushed past me the moment I stepped aside, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to follow her up the driveway. She stood in the middle of my living room, breathing hard, trying to steady herself. I closed the door and watched her pace in small circles like a trapped animal searching for escape. She finally sank onto the couch, buried her face in her hands, and let out a low, trembling sound. At first, I did not speak. I wanted her to find her own words. When she finally looked up, her eyes were rimmed with red and her voice cracked. She said she was in trouble, real trouble. Everything in her life was collapsing. Her job, her marriage, her reputation. She said people were after her and that she did not know where else to go. She pressed her palms together as if pleading for mercy. For a moment, the image did not match the woman who had sneered at me across a dinner table only nights before. This version of her was stripped of arrogance. I kept my distance but asked what she meant. Who was after her? She hesitated. I could see the conflict on her face. Then words spilled out in fragments. The restaurant owner had confronted her that morning after finding her in the office. Someone had shown him the video. Someone had sent him copies of the accounts. He threatened to call the authorities. She panicked and fled. She said she had nowhere else to go because Connor had not come home the night before, and she was afraid he had already learned the truth. I listened in silence. I did not want to tell her I knew more than she imagined. She clutched her bag tighter, her knuckles white. She said she needed my help. She said I had always been calm and level-headed, and maybe the only person who could understand her fear. That last part struck me harder than I expected. She had never looked at me as anything but an obstacle until this moment. I sat down across from her, keeping the coffee table between us, like neutral ground. I asked her what exactly she was afraid of. She looked toward the window, lowered her voice, and said she had taken money from the restaurant. Not the entire amount she was accused of, but enough to trigger suspicion when the numbers did not match. She said she planned to return it before anyone noticed, but the pressure of everything in her life had made her reckless. Then she said something that revealed more than she intended. She had hoped to use the ranch as collateral in some kind of deal to pay back the missing funds. My stomach tightened as she spoke. I asked her how the ranch had become part of her plan. She said she knew the property was valuable. She knew Connor had rights to it. She thought if she could convince him to push me aside, they could refinance or rent it out to pay off what she owed and help them start fresh. She said it all quickly, as if rushing past the shame. My breath caught. It was confirmation of what I had sensed for months. She never loved the land. She loved what it could give her. She leaned forward and whispered that someone else had been pressuring her too. A man she had once dated before meeting Connor. A man with influence in the restaurant world. Someone who had promised to help her hide the missing money but later started demanding favors she did not want to give. She said he had threatened to expose her unless she delivered the funds. She had been juggling lies for months, and they were finally collapsing. Hearing his name made my pulse jump. I recognized it from the restaurant emails on the flash drive. I asked her why she had come to me instead of going to her husband. She looked down at her hands and said she believed Connor would not forgive her if he learned the truth. She said I was the only one who had ever looked at her without trying to please her or impress her. She said maybe that meant I could be trusted. I almost laughed at the irony, but the fear on her face kept me still. A knock rattled the door, and Sienna jumped to her feet. Her breath hitched. I walked to the window and saw Deputy Mason, one of the sheriff's younger officers, stepping up onto the porch. I told Sienna to stay put and stepped outside, closing the door behind me. The deputy greeted me politely and asked if I had seen or heard from Sienna. He said her employer had filed a preliminary report, and the sheriff wanted to speak with her before matters escalated. He said she was not under arrest, but they needed to locate her. I kept my expression steady and said I had not seen her today. He nodded, tipped his hat, and returned to his car. When his vehicle disappeared down the road, I went back inside. Sienna stood in the middle of the room trembling. She asked if it was the police. I nodded. She slid down onto the couch, pulling her knees to her chest. She looked suddenly young, frightened, stripped of every harsh edge she once wielded. She whispered that she could not go to jail. She said her whole life would be ruined. I watched her carefully. Part of me felt sympathy. Part of me remembered every cruel glance and sharp word she had thrown at me. Both truths lived side by side. I asked her what she wanted from me. She said she needed time to think, a place to catch her breath. She begged me not to tell Connor where she was until she figured out what to do. She said he would hate her once he knew everything, and she could not face him yet. Her voice wavered with panic. I told her hiding would make things worse. She shook her head violently. She said she just needed a few hours. She said she would leave before dark. Her eyes pleaded with a desperation that reminded me of someone drowning and reaching for anything that floats. I agreed to give her time, not out of kindness, but because I needed time too. I needed to decide what came next. I offered her a glass of water and told her to rest in the guest room. She nodded and walked down the hall, her steps unsteady. When she disappeared into the room, I returned to the living room. The silence of the house pressed in around me, heavy and full of questions. I looked toward the hallway where she had gone, then toward the window overlooking the long driveway. The sky outside had begun to dim with the approach of evening. The wind carried a dry whisper through the trees. I realized then that nothing about this moment felt finished. It felt like the center of something still unfolding, something moving toward an edge I did not yet see. I sat down slowly, folded my hands in my lap, and tried to breathe through the sense that the storm I had feared was no longer on the horizon. It was already here. I sat there a long time, listening to the faint creaks of the house settling in the evening wind. Every sound felt sharper than usual, every passing second heavier. I kept glancing toward the hallway where Sienna had disappeared. half expecting her to come storming back out or crumble again in another fit of panic. Instead, the house remained still, too still. I rose from the chair and walked toward the kitchen, needing something to occupy my hands, but even the small tasks felt fragile against the weight of what was happening. A soft thump came from the guest room. I paused and listened. Another thump, lighter this time, then silence. I walked down the hall slowly and knocked on the door. She did not answer, so I opened it a few inches. Sienna sat on the edge of the bed with her shoulders hunched, her hands tangled in her hair. She did not look up until I stepped inside. Her face was blotched with the kind of exhaustion that comes from fear that has nowhere left to go. I asked if she needed anything. She shook her head. Her voice came out ragged when she spoke. She said she had ruined everything, that she had always been good at pretending nothing could touch her. But now all the pretending had finally collapsed. I stood there quietly, waiting for her to steady herself. She lifted her eyes and said she had not meant to hurt Connor. She said he was the only good thing she had ever had. She said she was certain she would lose him now. I had no answer for that. It was not my place to comfort her or condemn her. I told her she needed rest more than anything. I said she could stay for a short while, but she needed to think clearly about what came next. She nodded and lay back on the bed. I stepped out and pulled the door mostly closed. As I walked away, I thought of all the choices that had brought us to this strange, fragile moment. I could still feel the sting from the humiliation at the dinner, the sharp words that cut more deeply because they had come from family. Now that same woman lay in my guest room asking for refuge. I returned to the living room and sat near the window. The sky had darkened into a bruised purple, the last light fading behind the ridge. The ranch lights flickered on near the barn, casting long shadows across the yard. I tried to calm the swirl of thoughts moving through me, but the quiet only made them louder. I reached for the envelope Daniel had written all those years ago. I opened it again, reading his words under the lamplight, letting them anchor me. He had always seen things more clearly than I did. He trusted that I would know who was worthy of our home and who was not. I felt the truth of that now more than ever. The crunch of tires on gravel snapped my attention back to the present. My pulse jumped. I rose and moved quietly to the front window. A truck I recognized slowed near the porch. Connor stepped out, his face drawn and tense. He looked toward the house as if bracing himself. I opened the door before he reached it. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. The porch light cast a dim halo around him, making him look older than 35 and far more weary. He asked if she was here. His voice was low, almost defeated. I hesitated before answering. The pause was all he needed. He climbed the steps and came inside. He moved past me and stood in the center of the living room with his hands on his hips. He did not speak at first. He looked around the space he had grown up in, as if searching for something familiar that could steady him. Finally, he said he had been driving the roads between town and the ranch for hours. He said he had checked the places she frequented, called every friend she had, even driven to the restaurant again. No one knew where she was. He said he had been terrified that something had happened to her. I told him she was safe for the moment. I did not tell him the details yet. He ran a hand over his face and asked if he could see her. I said she was resting. He nodded and sank into the chair across from me. His shoulders slumped. He asked me what she had said. I told him she was scared. He asked of what. I chose my words carefully. I told him she had made mistakes, and that now those mistakes had begun to catch up with her. He stared at the rug, his jaw tightening. He said he had suspected something was wrong the moment she stopped answering his calls. He said she had been distant for weeks, snapping easily, losing sleep, pacing around the apartment at night when she thought he was not awake. He asked me whether I knew anything more than that. I thought of the flash drive, the emails, the video. I thought of Daniel's letter and how he warned me not to ignore signs of danger. I also thought of Connor's fragile face and how learning the truth too quickly could break him. I told him we could talk, but only if he steadied himself first. I said this situation required clarity, not panic. Rain began to tap against the windows. The sudden weather shift made the room feel colder. Connor leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. He asked me whether I believed Sienna had ever loved him. His voice cracked on the last word. It felt like a knife in my chest to hear my son question his own worth. I took a careful breath and reminded him that love does not vanish simply because someone fails. People make choices they regret. People get lost. People try to fix their lives in all the wrong ways. Before I could say more, a soft sound drifted down the hallway. The creak of the guest room door opening. Sienna appeared at the entrance to the hall, her face pale, her hands trembling. Connor rose to his feet instantly. He whispered her name. She flinched at the sound. For a long moment, they only stared at each other. Two people who had built a life on fragile ground suddenly seeing the cracks beneath them. She took a step forward, then stopped. She looked at him with eyes filled with apology and shame. She said she had not known where else to go. She said she did not want him to see her like this. He said he needed to understand what had happened. She shook her head and said understanding might not be possible. Not yet. He moved toward her slowly, as if approaching someone wounded. She backed away a step. She said he deserved better than the mess she had created. He said he did not want better. He wanted the truth. Her hands covered her face again as she crumbled into a quiet sob. He looked back at me with a desperate plea in his eyes. I could see the weight of all the unanswered questions bearing down on him. The room felt too small for the pain unfolding inside it. I stepped aside, giving them space, but I stayed close enough to intervene if needed. The emotional ground beneath them had become unpredictable. They stood there in the dim light, two souls unraveling, and I felt a shift in the air, a warning that the worst part of this had not yet surfaced. Outside, the rain picked up, hitting the roof in steady sheets. Inside the house, an uneasy quiet settled again, the kind that comes right before something breaks. Sienna lowered her hands and whispered that there was more she had not told him, much more, and she was not sure how to say any of it without losing him forever. Sienna stood trembling in the hallway, her eyes shifting between Connor and the floor, as if the truth she carried was too heavy to lift. Connor waited, shoulders tense, hands limp at his sides, the look on his face caught somewhere between fear and hope. I stayed near the dining table, close enough to steady things, if the moment shattered, but far enough to give them space to speak. Sienna drew a long, shaky breath. She said she had not been honest about her past. Not with him, not with anyone. She said the trouble at the restaurant was only the most recent piece of a long line of mistakes she had kept hidden. Her voice wavered as she said she had been living with the consequences of choices she made years ago. Choices she believed she had outrun. Choices she now realized had followed her straight into her marriage. Connor took a step closer, gently urging her to continue. She flinched but did not turn away. She said before she met him she had been involved with a man named Jonathan, the same man who now owned a chain of restaurants across Central Texas. She said he had helped her get the job at Ember and Oak, that he had pulled strings for her more than once. For a time she believed he cared about her, but when she tried to create a life separate from him, he began using his influence to corner her. At first it was small requests, then pressure, then threats. Connor blinked slowly as if his mind struggled to merge this version of her with the one he had loved. She said Jonathan had discovered the missing restaurant funds long before anyone else did, and instead of reporting her, he used it as leverage. She said he promised to make the problem disappear if she helped him with certain deals. She had agreed, terrified of criminal charges. But the favors grew more dangerous. She said she tried to cut ties with him several months ago, but by then he had too much on her. He had told her he could ruin her reputation, her career, and even her marriage. All he had to do was make one phone call. Connor stared at her as if trying to keep his thoughts from scattering. He asked why she had not told him any of this. She laughed bitterly at herself and said she had been ashamed. She said she never meant for any of it to touch him. She only wanted to build a future with him, but she did not know how to do that without lying. She said she had hoped she could fix everything before he ever found out. She said she was wrong. The rain pounded harder against the windows as her words spilled out. She confessed that she had gone to the restaurant office that morning to recover documents proving Jonathan had manipulated her. She believed the papers could protect her if things escalated, but the owner had caught her and demanded answers. She panicked and fled. She said she had driven aimlessly afterward until her thoughts turned to me. She said she knew I had always seen through her. She believed I could help her find a way forward. Connor sank into the chair behind him. His face was pale, his breath uneven. Sienna watched him with a pleading expression, waiting for something, anything, to show she had not completely lost him. He asked whether she had ever intended to use the ranch as collateral. She hesitated too long. His jaw tightened. She finally admitted that she had considered it when the pressure became unbearable. She said she had been desperate. She said she knew the ranch meant everything to him and to me, and that she hated herself for even thinking of it. He leaned back and pressed his hands to his face. The silence between them felt like the air before lightning strikes. He lowered his hands slowly and asked if Jonathan was still contacting her. She nodded. She said he had been calling and texting for weeks. He wanted something from her, something she did not specify, but he believed she still owed him. Her voice shrank as she said he was the reason she feared going to the police. She said she knew how powerful he was and that he had ways of making problems disappear. I felt the tension in the room shift. I knew that name carried weight in the hospitality world. I also knew men like that did not release their grip easily. Something in my chest tightened at the thought of the danger slipping into my home through her presence. Connor stood again, pacing once before turning to her. His voice broke as he asked if she had ever truly wanted a life with him, or if he had just been escaped from a situation she did not know how to leave. Her knees buckled at the question. She whispered that he was the only part of her life that was real. Everything else had been survival. For a moment, neither of them moved. The storm outside cast shifting shadows through the windows. Sienna reached for his hand. He did not pull away, but his fingers did not close around hers either. She rested there in that space of uncertainty, trembling, waiting. I stepped forward softly. I told them both that whatever came next needed clarity. Avoidance had led them to this breaking point. Denial had fed the fear. Lies had built a cage around their marriage until neither could breathe inside it. I said the truth, however painful, was the only way out. Sienna let go of Connor's hand and sank back onto the couch. She said she could not run anymore. She said she needed help but did not know where to start. Her voice cracked when she said she understood if he wanted nothing more to do with her. Connor closed his eyes, strained with heartbreak. He said he needed time, but time did not mean abandonment, not yet, not until he understood the full picture. A sudden clap of thunder shook the house. The lights flickered once, then steadied. The storm had settled directly over the ranch now. The tension in the air felt almost electric. I told them they both needed rest. Sienna nodded weakly. She looked as though she had not slept in days. Connor hesitated but agreed he should stay nearby in case things escalated. I could see the conflict in his eyes. He still loved her, but he did not trust her. Not tonight. They walked down the hall together. He guided her to the guest room, and I heard the soft murmur of his voice trying to steady hers. When he returned to the living room, he looked at me with eyes dulled by fear and exhaustion. He asked if he had been blind. I told him love often makes fools of all of us. That did not mean he was beyond repair. He sat on the couch and leaned his head back, staring at the ceiling. I sat across from him and folded my hands, giving him space to breathe. The storm outside softened into a steady patter, a rhythm that filled the heavy silence between us. Another hour passed before the house finally grew still. Connor drifted into a restless sleep. I remained awake, watching the shadows, listening for any sign of movement. The storm clouds stayed low over the ranch, dark and lingering. At some point near midnight, a faint sound echoed through the hall. Not from the guest room, from the front porch, a soft scrape, like a shoe brushing against wood, followed by a low thud that made my breath catch. I rose slowly, every muscle tightening, and stepped toward the entryway with quiet, careful steps, straining to hear what waited on the other side. I held my breath and moved closer to the door, listening for any other sound. The house was quiet except for the slow tick of the clock in the hallway and the soft rain tapping the porch roof. The scrape had been too deliberate to ignore. I reached for the small lamp near the entryway and switched it on, letting a thin glow spill across the floor. My pulse thudded in my ears as I leaned toward the peephole. A shadow shifted across the porch. I stepped back instinctively. For a moment, I thought of waking Connor, but something in me resisted. If he saw someone outside in the middle of the night while his wife slept down the hall, he would charge out there without thinking. That would only make things worse. I steadied myself and pressed my ear to the door. A low voice carried through the wood, muffled by rain, a man calling softly for someone to open up. I could not make out the name at first, but when he spoke again, the sound was unmistakable. He said, "Sienna." The air inside my chest locked tight. I moved fast and reached in to flip the porch light on. When the bulb hummed to life, I glanced through the window beside the door. A tall man in a suit stood on my porch. The rain had soaked through his jacket, his hair plastered to his forehead, but his posture was confident, too confident for someone standing in the dark on a stranger's porch. I recognized him from the photos on the flash drive. "Jonathan!" He knocked a second time, sharper this round, and called out again. His voice was smooth and controlled, but beneath it I felt something dangerous. I kept my voice steady as I spoke through the door. I told him it was late and he needed to leave. He paused, tilting his head as if trying to place my voice. Then he asked if Sienna was inside. I lied without hesitation and said she was not here. He let out a soft laugh that chilled me through the wood. He said he knew she had come this way, that her car had been spotted heading toward the ranch. He said he only wanted to talk to her. I told him again to leave. He stepped closer. His shadow darkened the frosted glass. He said he understood if I wanted to protect her, but this was business that did not involve me. He said she owed him answers, that she had made promises, that she had taken things she could not walk away from. He pressed his palm to the door as if he could feel the air inside. I did not raise my voice. I simply said he needed to leave the property immediately or I would call the sheriff. The shift in his posture was small, but unmistakable. The kind of stillness that comes from a man deciding how far he is willing to push his luck. After a tense moment, he stepped back into the rain. I waited until I saw him turn and walk toward the driveway before I locked the deadbolt. My hands trembled as I pulled the curtains closed. I could feel my heart beating in my throat. I walked quickly down the hallway and opened the guest room door. Sienna sat upright in the bed, eyes wide. She must have heard everything. She asked if he was here. I nodded. She began to shake. She said he would not stop until he found her. She said he had ways of getting what he wanted. Connor appeared behind me, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He asked who was outside. I told him he needed to stay calm, that we would talk in the living room. Sienna covered her face, tears streaking through her fingers. Connor moved toward her, but I stepped between them, knowing the conversation needed structure before it spiraled. We walked to the living room. I could see Connor's chest rising and falling with quick breaths. I told him the man on the porch was the same Jonathan she had mentioned. His jaw tensed. He asked if that meant Sienna had been telling the truth. I said some of it. Yes. Sienna stood near the doorway, head bowed. She said she never expected him to show up here. She said she thought she had more time. Connor demanded to know what this man wanted from her. She hesitated, then said Jonathan wanted leverage, wanted to own her fear, wanted to use her mistakes to bind her to him. She said she had been trapped long before she met Connor and did not know how to escape without destroying herself. Connor stepped toward her with a mixture of anger and heartbreak in his expression. He asked why she had let him believe she was building something honest with him. She began to cry again, saying she had hoped that by marrying him, she could finally outrun the life she had fallen into. She said she believed that if she kept her secrets buried long enough, she could become someone better. Connor turned away, rubbing his forehead as if trying to press back a wave of emotions. He asked why she thought my home was the place to hide. She said she knew I had seen through her from the beginning, that I had never been intimidated by her facade. She said she thought that meant I might know how to face something she could not. Her voice broke again on the last words. The storm outside began to shift, thunder rolling deeper across the hills. I felt it echo in my bones. I told them both we needed to think clearly. Jonathan had already shown he was willing to come this far. He would not stop at a polite request. Connor looked toward the window as if expecting the man to reappear. Then Connor turned toward Sienna with a steadying breath. He said running was not a plan. He said if Jonathan had broken the law, then the sheriff needed to know. She shook her head violently and said Jonathan had friends everywhere. She said he could twist the story to make her look like the instigator. She said powerful men had ways of staying clean while their victims looked desperate. Connor's face fell. He sat again, elbows braced on his knees. I could see the helplessness settling over him. I remembered that look from when he was 12 and trying to fix things beyond his control. My heart pinched at the memory. I told them both we would not make decisions tonight. We were too tired, too shaken, too raw. I said the sheriff needed to be contacted in the morning and that no one was going to force their way into my home, not while I was still standing. Sienna wrapped her arms around herself, whispering that Jonathan would return. I said he might, but so would the law if necessary. I had survived loss, hardship, and years of carrying a ranch alone. A manipulative man with threats did not scare me, but the fear in her eyes told me she had lived under his shadow long before we knew her name. The storm softened outside. The lightning faded to distant flickers. The air inside the room began to settle, but my nerves stayed alert. Connor asked if he could stay the night. I nodded. I did not trust the quiet yet. He went to make up the couch while I walked Sienna back to the guest room. She looked small and fragile in a way I had never seen. She whispered that she was sorry for the dinner, Sorry for everything. Sorry for dragging us into a life she did not know how to escape. I told her she needed rest. She nodded and lay down again. I pulled the door mostly closed and walked back toward the living room. The house felt heavy with the weight of all the unspoken fears. Connor had already stretched out on the couch, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He did not speak when I passed by, and I did not push him. Some truths take silence to settle. I moved to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. The night had grown unusually still. No more thunder, no more footsteps, just a quiet that felt too thin to trust. I lay down but stayed awake, listening for any hint of movement. Minutes passed. Then a soft vibration buzzed from the kitchen, my phone lighting up in the dark. I rose slowly and stepped into the hall. A single message glowed across the screen. It was from an unknown number, and it said, "I need to talk to you before this goes any further." The number on the screen meant nothing to me, yet the message sent a chill up my spine. I stared at it for several seconds, weighing whether to open it or wake Connor first. The house was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the old clock ticking in the hallway. I felt the heaviness of the night pressing in around me. Still, something in my gut told me not to ignore it. I tapped the message. A second line appeared beneath the first. It said, "I know what Jonathan is planning. It is not what you think." My heart thudded once, sharp and heavy. I looked toward the living room where Connor lay on the couch. He had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. His chest rose and fell in shallow rhythms. His arm flung over his forehead, as if trying to hold the world at bay. I could not wake him without knowing more. He was hanging by a thread already. I typed back one word, "Who?" The reply came almost instantly. "Meet me at the end of your driveway, 5 minutes." A warning bell rang inside me. I could not step outside alone, not with everything that had happened. I considered calling the sheriff, but something told me this message was not from a threat. Not yet, not a guarantee, but a feeling. Still, feelings were fragile things at midnight on a ranch. I unlocked the safe beside the pantry, pulled out the flashlight Daniel used to keep there, and tucked it into my jacket pocket. Before stepping onto the porch, I checked through the window. The rain had almost stopped. Only a fine mist drifted across the yard, turning the world silver under the porch light. I opened the door quietly and stepped outside, closing it gently behind me, so I would not wake Connor or Sienna. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of wet earth and cedar. I walked slowly down the gravel path, each step crunching in a rhythm that felt too loud in the stillness. The ranch stretched out around me, a dark sea pierced by faint starlight. As I neared the end of the driveway, a figure stepped from behind one of the oak trees. I froze, tightening my grip on the flashlight. The person lifted their hands in a gesture of peace. When they stepped into the glow of the distant yard light, I recognized the outline. Emily. She looked nervous, her hair pulled into a loose bun dampened by the mist. She had a hooded sweatshirt on over her work clothes, as if she had rushed out the moment she finished her shift. She apologized for coming so late. She said she would not have done it if she did not believe I was in danger. I exhaled slowly, lowering the flashlight a little, but not entirely. I asked what she meant. She stepped closer, glancing back toward the road as if expecting Jonathan to materialize from the shadows. She said she had overheard something earlier that evening while closing the restaurant. Jonathan had come in demanding to see the owner. She watched them argue through the office window. She said Jonathan was furious that someone had leaked information about the missing funds. He said he believed Sienna had documents that could implicate him as well. He said he needed those documents back, and he said he did not care who got hurt in the process. My stomach twisted. I had expected him to be dangerous, but not this blatant. Emily said the owner tried to calm him down, but Jonathan slammed his hand on the desk and said he knew Sienna had run to the ranch. He said he would get what belonged to him, even if he had to force his way in. Emily said she had heard enough and slipped away before they saw her. She said she debated calling the sheriff, but feared they would not take her seriously, so she came straight to me. My pulse pounded so loudly I could feel it in my teeth. I told her he had already come to the ranch. Her eyes widened with shock. She looked around nervously again and asked if he was still nearby. I shook my head. She let out a breath of relief that barely lasted a second before her face hardened with resolve. She said I needed to give the sheriff the evidence on the flash drive first thing in the morning. She said Jonathan was not going to stop until he got what he wanted. She said Sienna was not safe, and neither was the ranch. I listened, absorbing every word, feeling the weight of the truth settling over me like a storm cloud that refused to lift. I thanked her for coming. She hesitated before heading back to her car. She turned and said something that lingered long after she drove away. She said men like Jonathan survive because people stay quiet. She told me not to stay quiet. When her taillights disappeared into the night, I stood alone on the gravel, the mist gathering on my jacket sleeves. The ranch was silent again, but it no longer felt like the silence I had always trusted. It felt like the moment right before something breaks. I walked back towards the house, stepping carefully across the wet stones. Halfway down the driveway, I saw a faint glow from one of the windows. The shape of someone moving behind the curtain, my breath caught. Connor, maybe. But something in the movement felt different. Slower, taller. I quickened my pace, trying to stay quiet. The porch steps creaked under my weight. When I reached the door, I gripped the handle softly and pushed it open. Inside the living room, Connor was still asleep on the couch. The glow I had seen was not from him. It came from farther down the hall, from the guest room. I moved carefully in that direction, my feet pressing gently into the carpet. When I reached the open doorway, I saw Sienna standing near the bed with her back to me. She held her phone in both hands, shaking so violently I could hear the faint clatter of the casing against her rings. On the screen was a text message. It said, "You should have never run from me." Her breath hitched. She stared at the screen as if it were a weapon. Then another message appeared underneath it before she could even react. "I am closer than you think." Sienna's fingers tightened around the phone as if she could crush the threat right out of it. Her breathing grew sharp and uneven. I stepped into the doorway and spoke her name softly. She flinched, turning toward me with eyes wide and glassy. The screen lit her face with a cold glow. She handed me the phone without a word. The message stared up at me like a warning carved in stone. I told her to sit. She lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, knees pressed together, shoulders trembling. I asked when the last message from him had come before this. She said nothing for a moment, then whispered that he had stopped for a few days. She thought maybe he had moved on. Maybe she had finally slipped away. Then this. I sat beside her and told her we were not dealing with guesses anymore. He was escalating. That meant he was afraid. Men like him lash out when they lose control. She shook her head and said I did not understand. Jonathan did not lose control. He calculated everything. If he was texting her now, he had a plan in motion. I took the phone again and studied the message. My stomach tightened. I told her to stay in the room with the door closed. She asked if Connor knew. I told her no. Not yet. She nodded as if that hurt more than anything Jonathan had said. When I reached the hallway, I paused, listening to the quiet of the house, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel amplified. I walked to the living room where Connor still slept on the couch. I leaned down and touched his shoulder. His eyes snapped open immediately. I told him we needed to talk. He sat up fast, looking around as if expecting someone to be standing in the shadows. I explained the message. His jaw tightened, and his hands curled into fists. He wanted to storm outside and wait for Jonathan to show himself. I told him no. That was exactly the mistake Jonathan wanted him to make. I said this needed to be handled with clarity, not fists, not rage, not the kind of reckless impulse that ruins men. He stood, pacing, running his hands through his hair. He asked if Sienna was safe. I said only if we stayed ahead of this. I told him about Emily's warning, that Jonathan was looking for documents he believed Sienna had, that he would not give up. Connor's face went pale. He asked what documents. I said it did not matter right this second. What mattered was what we did next. I told him we were calling the sheriff right now. He nodded, but I could see the shame in his eyes. Shame for letting himself fall for someone who had been hiding so much. Shame for not seeing the danger sooner. Shame for doubting me. I put a hand on his arm and said this was not the time for that. We needed to be a team, even if the ground beneath us was unstable. I called the sheriff's office. The dispatcher knew me by name. She said a deputy was finishing a call nearby and could be at the ranch within 15 minutes. I thanked her, then locked every window in the living room while Connor checked the back door. The storm had stopped entirely, but the air still smelled charged, like something was waiting in the dark trees. The headlights swung into the driveway sooner than I expected. Deputy Lane stepped out of the patrol car, adjusting his hat as he approached the porch. He was young but steady, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He asked what happened. I showed him the messages. He read them slowly, then looked up with an expression that told me he took this far more seriously than I feared. He asked where Sienna was. I brought him to the guest room. She looked smaller than before, sitting rigidly on the bed with her hands knotted in her lap. He crouched down so his eyes met hers. He asked if she was willing to make a statement. She hesitated but nodded. As she began to talk, the truth finally came out in full. The financial scheme at Jonathan's company, the forged signatures she had uncovered, the amounts missing, the threats when she confronted him privately, the manipulation, the night he took her phone and forced her to send emails blaming others. She spoke in starts and stops, her voice cracking at points, but the pieces came together like shards of broken glass. Deputy Lane wrote everything down. When she finished, he stood slowly and exhaled. He said there was enough here to open an investigation. He said she could file for a protection order. He said Jonathan might already be in serious legal trouble if the documents existed. I asked what we should do for the rest of the night. He said he would patrol the road for a while, but he could not station himself here indefinitely. He suggested we all stay in the same part of the house and keep the doors secured. He said if Jonathan returned, we were to call him immediately, no matter the hour. When he left, the house felt too quiet again. I told both of them to move into the living room. I brought blankets and pillows. None of us were going to sleep well, but at least we would not be scattered across the house. Sienna sat on the floor beside the couch, knees pulled up, staring at the cold fireplace. Connor sat cross-legged near her, though he kept some distance, his shoulders tight with conflict. I sat in the old armchair watching them both. Hours passed, no messages, no footsteps, no headlights, just the slow crawl of night toward dawn. Sometime near morning, I heard Connor quietly say Sienna's name. She lifted her head. He looked at her for a long moment before saying he wished she had trusted him sooner. She whispered that she wished she had, too. Their voices were soft, but carried years of hurt that did not belong to people as young as they were. The first pink streaks of sunrise touched the windows. I stood and stretched my back, feeling every bit of my age. I told them I would make coffee. It felt like the first normal thing I had said in days. When I stepped into the kitchen, I paused at the window above the sink. A patrol car rolled slowly past the end of the driveway. Deputy Lane kept his word. I felt a quiet wave of gratitude. By noon, the sheriff himself arrived with 2 detectives. They spoke with Sienna for nearly an hour. They asked for the flash drive. I retrieved it and watched their faces as they clicked through the files. One detective stiffened. The sheriff's expression tightened. They said this was more than enough to pursue charges. Later that afternoon, they located Jonathan's car, abandoned outside of town. By evening, they took him into custody. The relief that swept across the ranch was not dramatic. It was slow and steady, like exhaling after holding a breath for far too long. When I walked back into the living room, Sienna stood near the window with her arms wrapped around herself. She turned toward me, eyes shining, but not with fear this time, with something like gratitude. She thanked me for not giving up on her. I said she had done the brave part. She had told the truth. Connor stepped beside her. His voice was quieter than usual when he said they both needed time, but he wanted to try again if she was willing. She nodded with a softness I had not seen in her since the day they married. For the first time in a long while, the house felt like a place with air again, a place where people could breathe. That night, I sat on the porch alone, watching the fireflies rise over the fields. The cicadas hummed low in the trees. I felt the stillness of the land settle into me. I thought about everything that had happened, how easily cruelty finds cracks in people, how easily fear grows in silence, how hard it is to stand firm when the world tilts under your feet. But we had made it through. If you have ever faced a moment where you had to choose between fear and truth, or between silence and stepping forward, I would love to hear your story. Share it with me in the comments. And if this journey kept you with me, make sure you stay close for the next one. There are more stories to tell, and I hope you will be here for them.